In this video, we take a look at vulnerability response in the ServiceNow platform. Linked timecodes for these topics appear in the YouTube description for this video. To understand vulnerability response with ServiceNow, let's first take a look at the typical vulnerability response process within an enterprise. To detect and protect network resources from threats, most organizations implement a number of vulnerability scanners and security tools. Scanners include any third-party integrations such as Qualys, Tenable, or Rapid7 that check the network and flag hosts, detections, and vulnerabilities. Hosts are the computers that the scan finds on the network. Vulnerabilities are records of security checklist references, security-related software flaws, misconfigurations, product names, and impact metrics downloaded from the National Institute of Standards and third-party vulnerability data producers. And detections are vulnerable items or the hosts on your network with a vulnerability. Network security personnel, such as system administrators, vulnerability administrators, and vulnerability analysts, converge to manually analyze the scans and decide which vulnerable items to take action on and in what priority. But there's a problem. Scanners are not at all discriminating. They provide a data dump of information. For a large enterprise, this could amount to millions of records, many of which aren't relevant. But why is that? Let's look at an example. Joe's laptop has two IP addresses, an IP on the corporate network and a wireless network IP. A scan may flag one software vulnerability on the laptop as two detections due to the two different IPs, one from Ethernet and the other from wireless connections. One patch would fix both detections. The vulnerability response application within ServiceNow handles detections by pulling the raw detection data from scans and comparing it to configuration items, or CIs, in the Configuration Management Database, or CMDB. So in our example, Joe's laptop is identified as one vulnerable item by the Vulnerability Response app, not two. And with data from the CMDB, the Vulnerability Response app can further differentiate between vulnerable items to prioritize remediation. The patch needed on Joe's employee laptop, for example, would be less critical than a patch needed on the email server used worldwide on a daily basis. After narrowing down the vulnerabilities flagged by the scan, the remaining vulnerable items still need to be prioritized, both by the severity of the vulnerability itself and the potential impact on the organization, and then remediated. That's where vulnerability groups come in. You can group vulnerable items by various criteria to create vulnerability groups so they can be monitored, updated, and remediated. To create vulnerability groups, you choose the criteria for each group. A vulnerable item that meets the criteria of the group will appear when you run the filter. A vulnerable item can belong to more than one vulnerability group. Vulnerability groups are a child of the task table in the ServiceNow platform, so you can create change requests directly from the vulnerability groups. The lifecycle of vulnerable items and vulnerability groups follows the PDCA cycle of process improvement. First, plan. When new vulnerable items are identified, group them into vulnerability groups and plan which groups to fix. Second, do. Create change requests to remediate the selected vulnerability groups. Third, check. Verify that the problem was fixed on the target configuration item. And fourth, act. Take action to standardize or improve the process, such as changing the criteria for a vulnerability group. Each step in the process is completed and documented in the ServiceNow platform, and it dovetails perfectly with GRC, making it audit-friendly. Now let's look at the steps to create a vulnerability group and fix the vulnerable items within that group via a change request. Let's create our previous example. We want a vulnerability group for vulnerabilities with critical business impact to our product kiosk. We know the conditions we want for this filter, so we select Condition as the filter type, and we set up the conditions for this vulnerability group. To automatically add and remove vulnerable items to and from vulnerability groups, we select the option to automatically refresh vulnerable items. When we save the form, the list of vulnerable items that meet the criteria appears in the associated vulnerable item list. Now we can create a change request right here from the vulnerability group to fix the vulnerable items. We do this in just 3 steps. First, we assign the vulnerability group to an assignment group or user. Second, we start the investigation. Third, we create the change request, which directs the assigned group or user to remediate the vulnerable items within the group. After the change request for remediating the vulnerable items is completed by the assigned group or user, we set the vulnerability group to the resolved state, indicating that the requested work is complete. However, the state of the vulnerability group won't move to closed until a subsequent scan reports that all vulnerable items included in the group are remediated. In our example, we've taken a vulnerability detection from a scanner, driven a change, and confirmed that the change had the intended effect. The Vulnerability Response application gives you the ability to perform closed vulnerability remediation with complete control and traceability. For more information, please consult our product documentation, knowledge base, or podcast, or ask a question in the ServiceNow community.